Thank you, everybody. We made it to the end, last presentation, and we're going to throw out as many buzzwords and acronyms as possible within 45 minutes to send everyone off with. But in all seriousness, today we're going to talk about ground zero, zero trust, right? I know zero trust is a buzzword. It's a marketing term. We only have 45 minutes today, so we're not going to be able to cover all aspects of everything that can fall or potentially fall underneath the zero trust umbrella. But what we do want to provide today is an overview of what are the foundational components that are super, super important to get right the first time as you build your zero trust roadmap and as you start to align your architecture. So we're going to talk through what are some of the common challenges that we see organizations face when they're considering zero trust and starting to align to some of the principles and concepts. So we'll talk about that at a high level. But most importantly, I want to focus in on some of the recommendations. What are the practical things that organizations can do to create a strong foundation that they will then build their zero trust model on top of? So at Mandiant, I've been working at Mandiant for over 7 years. I'm part of our security transformation services team. So we work with clients reactively during incident response engagements and investigations. We are the team that does containment, eradication, remediation, and then also works with some of the transformational efforts that come out of those engagements. And then we also work with clients proactively doing technical architecture reviews and really just helping clients focus and understand potential risks and misconfigurations and really helping organizations align to a stronger cybersecurity foundation. So some of the challenges that we'll talk about and the recommendations that we'll go through today really come from the front lines of what do we see when we are working with clients, whether they're considering zero trust or whether they're just trying to help strengthen their posture from going to on-prem to the cloud. So we're going to do a quick, 10 minutes or less history lesson of zero trust. So when we hear the term zero trust, right, let's kind of take a step back and realize where exactly we came from. So when we think about our architecture, the way our current architectures are designed, and we've inherited these architectures over time, they were really predicated on the principle of trust but verify, right? And that trust was earned, if you will, via a singular transaction. And in most cases, that singular transaction was an authentication, right? So it's a user, it's an identity, proving their trustworthiness by the user entering their username and password. Back in the day, hopefully today it's username, password, and multi-factor authentication. But historically, once that singular transaction happened, right, that was opening the front door for that identity to have access to data, to different parts of the network, whether it be on-prem or cloud, and to really have potentially unfettered access, or maybe it's access based upon static role assignments and mappings. Let's think about how we operate today, right? Our users are now distributed, especially post-COVID. Our devices are mobile, they're mobilized. Our data is hybrid, so it means some of it's on-prem, some of it's on cloud, multi-cloud. It's when it's within software as a service or SaaS-based providers. And our traditional ingress, egress, perimeter hardware base is going away, right? It's now software defined. And right now, users and devices are really the front lines of protections against malicious access to our data. So when we think about zero trust, it takes the concept of trust but verify, throws that to the side, and predicates on never trust, always verify continuously. And continuously is an important term, which we'll talk through. And it's not just a singular transaction. Think of it as multiple transactions, multiple ways that users and devices are verifying their level of trust. So that's not only someone authenticating using strong authentication, it's looking at attributes of the device with which they are authenticating from. It's the network infrastructure associated with that device. It's related to the data that user or that device is looking to access. It's no longer just a static 12 or 24-hour based session. It's a dynamic session for authentication and authorization, and it's really based upon risk. And that level of trust may change over time. It's also important to call out that zero trust is not like one thing that you go and buy from one vendor that has the zero trust stamp of approval. You buy that, you implement it, and you're good to go. There are really strong foundational processes and methodologies. We need to synergize our technology stacks together to create a zero trust type architecture. So just a quick history lesson here. So there's a lot of great documentation. There's a lot of great frameworks and roadmaps that have been released over the past few years related to zero trust. NIST Special Publication 800-207 is probably one of the more comprehensive vendor-agnostic documents that was released back in 2020. And what it does is it provides foundational elements of what does it take to build an effective zero trust architecture. It's a very detailed document, a lot of acronyms in it, and we'll go through it at a super high level here in just a second. But following that, in 2021, in response to some of the high-profile breaches that happened, the Biden administration issued an executive order which aligned that federal organizations start to abide by some of the principles and core concepts outlined within this SP 800-207. And then I think in June of 2021, CISA released their Zero Trust Maturity Framework and Model. And that really aligns zero trust elements. It breaks things down into 5 pillars of identities, devices, networks, applications and workloads, and data. But the important part of that whole guide, it provides a maturity roadmap of good, better, best, of how to start aligning to the concepts defined within 800-207. But the important foundational element that those 5 pillars are built on is visibility, orchestration, and automation. And then the key piece to this whole thing is governance, right? It's kind of implied when you read these documents, but it's not necessarily called out. So I just want to highlight that the governance and the processes behind how we build our framework is super, super important, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the 1-minute overview of 800-207, it's a fairly lengthy and complex document, so we're just going to do it at a super high level. A lot of acronyms in this document, but if you hear the term PDP, it refers to the policy decision point. And think of this as the brain, right? With our body, our brain helps us make informed decisions, right? The stems of our brain, we need the information fed to us to make sure that we're making the right decision. The stems of the brain are policy enforcement points, or PEPs. PEPs already exist in most environments today. These can be agents running on an endpoint. These can be intel signals. It can be information attributes we're getting from our centralized identity provider. It could be from our network infrastructure, our network stack via on-prem or cloud. PEPs exist already today. So the PDP process is really just aligning a way. Think of the PEP as the bouncer at the door. It's going to collect your identification, send it back to the PDP. The PDP wants to correlate it. It wants to make an intelligent, informed decision of, are we going to allow access? Are we going to deny access? Or are we going to require a re-authentication or revalidation? That's essentially what Zero Trust is predicated on in 800-207 by some of the acronyms and concepts in the guide. So, taking a giant step back, probably the most important slide in the deck right here is when we think about Zero Trust and we're looking to onboard technologies, processes, plans of how do we create this foundation within our organization, we want to be asking ourselves, does our strategy align to the 3 C's? As far as continuous, right? Continuous verification of users and devices and what they're accessing. We're going away from that singular transaction. We want to verify this on a repeated basis because risk can change, right? I could authenticate, I could connect into an environment, 10 minutes later, my endpoint gets popped. Maybe I have a backdoor, something bad happens. Our PDP needs to be able to have that information to make a decision of whether we need to terminate that session, isolate that device, require the user to re-authenticate, and really just help mitigate risk to our environment. Contextual, the PDP does not work without all the stems coming together and being fed information so an actionable decision can be made based upon the current state of information being fed. And we need correlation, right? And that's essentially what the PDP does. It brings all of our moving parts together and helps synergize our architecture to create this framework. So I'm going to focus on identities. This is one of the core pillars of Zero Trust. And in 800-207, identity governance is a huge component of this. So this is super, super important to get right the first time. So what are some of the challenges we see with organizations? They're on a Zero Trust journey, or maybe they're just trying to better bolster their architecture and their processes. Today, there's an unclear mapping and understanding of the different types of identities that exist within an environment. And we'll talk through what I mean by that. We have distributed identity stores. We have historical debt, if you will, of identity stores when we do mergers and acquisitions and we join domains together and we trust those domains. We have identity stores that are all over the place. It gets even more complex when we start migrating to cloud, Sometimes we're syncing, on-prem identities to cloud and vice versa. So there's a lot of complexities with distributed identity stores and trying to bring all of this signaling together. We also have a lack of strong authentication, right? So there still is a lack of multi-factor authentication today, and we'll do a deep dive of MFA in a little bit. But also, when you think about zero trust, right? If something happens within our session and we want to require a user an identity to re-authenticate, what does that step-up authentication process look like? Is it a new MFA every X number of hours? What does that process look like? So we need to define that. And last but not least, there's an excessive scope of privileged identities. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. So if you haven't started just mapping some of your identities that exist within your environment today, this is a very simplistic, overly simplistic model to follow, but it works. Right? So identities, when we think of accounts, we used to just think of the accounts that we use as humans, and the user accounts that live in our identity provider. They represent probably the largest base of accounts that we have, but these are the ones that we use. These are our daily driver type of accounts. On the right, we also have programmatic accounts. Back in the day, these used to be our service accounts. Think of these as accounts that we use to do automated things. We might not be interactively logging in or using these accounts from a human perspective, but they do play an important role within our organization. Now with cloud, programmatic accounts can be API keys and just different methods of automation that exist within cloud. And in the middle, we have privilege. We have a lot of privileged accounts that humans use. We unfortunately have a lot of privileged accounts that are service accounts and programmatic. But these are all accounts, identities that we manage within our organization. Where it gets a little more complex is when we have guests and third-party accounts. We oftentimes don't have direct control over account requirements for external identities that we are allowing into our environment to access our data and to maybe even access our infrastructure. So this can certainly present a challenge. So what sort of guardrails can we put around these types of accounts? Like I said, if you haven't started mapping, a very simplistic way to start organizing and categorizing the types of identities that exist within your environment. So not all of our identities are created equal. So we're going to have a little fun here on a graph. So what I like to do is after we kind of have our buckets of identities, is let's understand just how powerful some of these accounts are or how powerful they can be. And could a compromise of an identity reflect as lateral movement, an opportunity for lateral movement, or privilege escalation? So we have on the left there, we have the attack surface, the overall exposure of the account. And at the bottom, we have the level of privilege that an account may have. So back in the day, I think this was more the norm. When we were strictly on-prem before organizations moved to cloud, these are now unicorn type of accounts. They don't really exist very often that an org is just strictly on-prem unless it's like a government or military type space. But these are accounts that have, they're not privileged. They don't really have a whole lot of exposure. Maybe it's because they're on-prem, or maybe it's just because we have good, strong controls around authentication, role-based access control. Maybe we're using attribute-based access control. But we have a strong element around these accounts to protect them. Here's where we are today. We have accounts with a high degree of exposure, and it's just due to the distributed way that we operate today. So when we went to the cloud, right, this has now become a risk. We have accounts that maybe or identities that don't require multi-factor authentication for whatever reason. We have legacy authentication. I think we're getting better there, but it still is a risk. Maybe we didn't do proper endpoint hardening. So an endpoint gets compromised, attacker is able to gather credentials from memory, from disk, and use those to pivot and laterally move. So that's obviously a challenge. This right here is where attackers want to be. They want to get up into the upper right quadrant there, because these are the crown jewel accounts, keys to the kingdom accounts that exist in every organization. And if one of these types of accounts is compromised, it's a really, really bad day, month, week, year, you name it. It's really, really bad. So this, from a zero trust perspective, when we think about least privilege and trying to pull back the scope of privileges and make these not static associations, but more dynamic and just in time, what we want to do is try to harden those accounts. We're always going to have privileged identities and accounts. That's never going to go away. But what we want to do is reduce their level of exposure, their attack surface, and put some guardrails around this. And these concepts that you see here in blue align to what is predicated or what is part of a zero trust from an identity perspective. So it's not just from the account perspective itself. Also understand from the types of accounts we have there on the left, they might have line of sight to an account that's up in that quadrant that could be used for lateral movement. So we really want to take away that opportunity and start putting some guardrails around our identity. So best practices, right? We want to start defining and enforcing our authentication requirements based upon where we are in that quadrant. Obviously, MFA is going to be something that we always want to achieve. It may not always be permissible, especially from on-prem. Like you can't MFA traditionally, like SMB type connections and other methods. It's a little bit harder. But at least from our attack surface of those accounts that have a greater exposure, we want to start ensuring that we have strong protections around those identities and those account attributes. We want to try to align centralization for our identity stores. This is one of the biggest challenges organizations have if they're trying to go to a zero trust model, is they have identity stores all over the place. There isn't a true source of truth for what constitutes the centralized identity store. And going back to that PDP model with the brain, if we have identity stems all over the place, how hard is it going to be to correlate all of that information together? It's not going to work very effectively. So trying to centralize and aggregate the multiple identity stores into a collapsible structure is where organizations want to go. We also want to understand risk-based identity and session risk. So if something is detected based upon an attribute of an identity, we can take action. And that is in the form of, in Zero Trust, step-up authentication, so requiring the user to re-authenticate or use a stronger method for authentication. And we want to isolate and protect our privileged accounts. Let's talk about multi-factor authentication. This is another important component of a Zero Trust architecture. So what are challenges organizations face with MFA? It's the onboarding and enrollment. We'll talk through some examples of what attackers are doing and what are some of the recommendations that kind of come out from MFA onboarding and enrollment. There's weak MFA methods that can be bypassed. We'll talk through some examples of that. This could also be legacy authentication, but once again, we have to ensure that we're using strong and sound MFA methods based upon our attack surface. Lack of visibility to identify where we still allow single-factor authentication. A lot of incidents that we support at Mandiant, unfortunately, yes, the organization had MFA on their VPN, they had MFA in all the places, but yeah, there was that legacy VPN that was still out there because somebody needed to use it for whatever reason, and it was single factor, and that was the way in, and there were very few controls around that, or even acknowledgement that that existed, right? This is technical debt that we need to figure out how do we get away from. And then we have MFA exemptions. Not all accounts, think about those programmatic buckets of accounts support MFA, right? Because it's going to take away the automated way that those accounts are used. But we still have to understand the scope of accounts we have that can actually bypass our MFA controls. Why is that? And what other guardrails can we put in place to better protect those accounts and pull back permissions? Remember, zero trust, least privilege. This is where we want to be. So never pass up an opportunity for another graph, right? So here we go. So we're going to talk about MFA, the different MFA methods that are out there. I think you probably heard from Jen Easterly's keynote this morning, and I think it was implied that not all MFA methods are the same, but no MFA is not where we want to be at all. But unfortunately, there are organizations that just haven't implemented MFA. So any sort of MFA is a little bit better than having none. I will say that not all MFA methods are going to protect an organization. It might slow down an attacker, but it's certainly not going to take away risk. So right here we have some examples of these are our legacy ways that we used to do MFA. Unfortunately, they are still around. They're still used. But when we hear about MFA fatigue, we hear about users just getting spammed with push notifications and phone calls in the middle of the night and all kinds of other crazy things. We hear about SIM swapping. We hear about multi-factor codes being intercepted. These kind of fall within this tier of, does it cost a lot to put these in place? But really not getting a whole lot of protection today based upon what attackers are doing. And I'll share an example of exactly what are attackers doing to get around MFA. So these methods no longer really stand the test of time, if you will, from the threat landscape today. So what can we do to make it a little bit harder for an attacker? And maybe it's not as much of a cost from an organizational perspective to roll out. So in the middle, we have the yellow circle. We could put service limits, timeouts, make it so you can only have push notifications go out 5 at a time over a certain amount of over a certain period. That's not going to solve the problem. It might slow down an attacker, but once again, if the user just clicks the accept for the push once, it really doesn't matter if you had that. So where we want to go is passwordless sign-in mechanisms, but really getting more context in front of the user to make an informed decision. Goes back to one of the 3 C's that we had in the slide in the beginning. So we want to be able to do passcode validation matching, but we want to enrich that with information about where is this request being originated from geo context? What application is actually making the request? So we can do this now with conditional access policies in Microsoft Azure. We can do it in Duo. We can do it in Okta. We can do it with Google. There's different ways, there's different technologies and methods that vendors are integrating. So there's Duo Verified Push, there's Okta Verify. There's now more ways that you can actually allow the user to make an informed decision of, am I going to click yes? Or hopefully we're doing number matching where it makes it a lot harder for the attacker to socially engineer and trick a user. Can these methods be bypassed? Yeah, they can. So where do we want to go? When you hear about phishing-resistant MFA, you hear about FIDO, the fast identity online 2 devices and mechanisms. This is where we want to go from a phishing resistance perspective. We also have OATH tokens. Now don't confuse that with OAuth. I confused that the first time I saw that. OATH is an authentication protocol. OAuth is authorization. And we'll talk about OAuth in just a little bit. And even with Azure AD now, supports X509 certificates and PIV cards. Right? So these actually provide pretty much the ultimate defense, if you will, from what techniques attackers are using for phishing. But these come at a cost. Right? Rolling these out is not going to be cheap. It takes time. There's inventory. There's, well, what happens if I roll out these devices and somebody loses it or it breaks? Are they locked out until I can ship them a new one? There's training. There's applications that maybe don't support FIDO2 or some of these other methods. And some organizations are finding out they have to pay what's called the SSO tax, if you've heard of that. That's a term going around where you kind of have to put these under your umbrella of your SSO within your IDP to maybe get around the fact that the application or the website doesn't support FIDO2 quite yet. So that's why it's higher up from a cost perspective. But this is kind of where you want to be, and you want to start rolling, especially for a FIDO2 perspective, for your highly privileged accounts. So how does FIDO2 work? Like, why is it so good? Why is everyone talking about this? It kind of goes back to the day of PKI. So it uses public key cryptography. So what happens is, right there, I'm going to register at legitsite1.com. I'm going to put my identity, me at google.com. I've got my FIDO device. And what happens is when you register your login, and the website supports FIDO2, there's actually a key pair that's created between the FIDO device and the site. The private key is stored on your FIDO device. The public key is associated with the login on the site. And whenever you attempt to authenticate, there's a signature that's required to be validated. The signature is signed with the private key. It has to match with the public key is the only one that can decrypt it. So it's asymmetric key encryption. There's also, when you see the relying party ID, that's supported if you hear about FIDO2 Web Auth N. So there pretty much has to be a match, a one-to-one match of that website. So if I'm an attacker and I phish a user, I send them a link that looks like legit site 1, but it's actually legitsitell.com. Maybe to my eye, I think it looks legit. Okay, well, I'm going to try it on my FIDO device and try to authenticate. It's not going to work because the relaying party ID is not going to match from a DNS perspective. And that site, that attacker site, doesn't have the public key associated with my ID because I never registered my FIDO device there. So this is why when you hear about phishing resistant and trying to trick users, this is why these tools are a nice safety net to protect our ability to trust. So what are attackers doing to get around like passwordless and some of these other, well, not necessarily passwordless, but push notifications and number matching and some of the other MFA methods that are out there. So adversary in the middle phishing has certainly come to light over the past year. There's a lot of good blogs out there about it. Microsoft has a really great resource article. But essentially, it's attackers setting up proxy infrastructure in the middle to intercept the process of authentication and steal the session token for a post-authenticated session. So here's how it works. The important part is at the top when you have the SSL termination at the attacker's site. So there's a tool called EvilGenix 2 that will actually do this. This is what attackers love to do now. So a user might get a phishing email. They're going to click it. What's going to happen is their communication is going to go to the attacker's site. SSL termination is going to happen. The attacker's proxy is going to send it on to the legit site, and the user will authenticate. They'll get the prompt. You're going to get the MFA response, all going back through the attacker's infrastructure. The attacker doesn't care about the MFA method, in all honesty, unless it's FIDO2. But if it's just a push notification or even number matching, this could be a method that attackers are using to bypass. And it's going to continue to go through. And what's going to happen is session cookie is actually going to go to the attacker because they're able to terminate the SSL session. User, maybe they get an error message, maybe a document opens, who knows. But the attacker has access via the valid session token. There is token binding with FIDO2 UTF that even if for some crazy reason, the FIDO protocol didn't stop the attack with token binding, it actually associates the token and the cookie with the browser of origin, so it can't be replayed. But anyway, this is what is happening. So from a FIDO2 perspective, that would not work because the relaying party ID, when that SSL session is terminated at the attacker site, I don't have a match in DNS on my key, and I don't have keys associated with the attacker site whatsoever. So that's why the defense is FIDO2 security keys, Azure AD certificate-based auth, and Windows Hello, which is a passwordless feature as well. Once again, it falls kind of under the public key cryptography method that we talked about with FIDO. Azure conditional access can also help here, because if you have a required device to be marked as compliant, marked as hybrid Azure AD joined, or if you enforce trusted locations, these methods and conditional access policies are enforced every time the session cookie is refreshed. So if an attacker tried to use a stolen cookie and you had these elements required in a conditional access policy, it could also stop the attacker from actually using that cookie. Does the authenticator app with number matching or additional context stop this attack? No, because a user, maybe maybe they have the right context, but for whatever reason, accidentally, they accepted the prompt, they accepted the MFA. It could still happen. That's why the FIDO2 method is kind of the bar that we want to get to. Won't spend a whole lot of time here, but OAuth consent, so additional ways that attackers are getting past MFA this is, once again, authorization. So this could be where a user consents to an application that's malicious in nature, and they have given the application permission, authorization to access data, maybe access, mailbox, or it just could be, any sort of applications that are cloud hosted. And whether the user changes their password, adds a new MFA device, it's irrelevant because generally credentials are going to be associated with that application. And we've actually seen this happen when you see their workload abuse with keying materials being associated with service principals and applications in the cloud that don't enforce MFA, and the attacker pretty much has control over that authenticator. And there's a detailed white paper that we put out after the SolarWinds incident that explains all the nuances there. We also have credential keys with programmatic accounts. As mentioned, oftentimes you're not going to use MFA with those because it's going to take away the automated nature of the way that those accounts are used. And then PRT, primary refresh token abuse, single sign-on. This is relevant for Azure AD or Azure AD hybrid join devices. Different methods that can happen, but once again, we want to try to, FIDO2 is kind of the way we want to go from the identity perspective from hardening. So bringing it all together, what can we do? Let's give the human context around what they are consenting to or what are they authenticating. Is it something that they actually initiated? Or if it's something that the attacker did, give the user enough context, information to make an informed decision. In the event that we make a bad decision, which we do, we're human, right? We want those FIDO2 keys to be our safety net because it's not going to allow that second part of the authentication to happen. We actually want to require MFA device validation. This is not multi-factor authentication. It's what I refer to as multi-pillar authentication. So this is not only a user authenticating, but it's also having a validation around the device that the user is using as part of that authentication process. Remember, we're going away from singular transaction to a dynamic multi-transaction. This is an example of that. We can actually reduce our session lifetime tokens. We can do this with all the major cloud providers now. So definitely something to take a look at. Can minimize some of the impact of a session token theft. And we want to actually, when users are updating their MFA methods, we want to actually require that they can't do that using single-factor authentication, if at all possible. So what are some challenges that we're seeing with registration and verification? I'm just going to play these out for the sake of time. Right now, it's very difficult, for organizations sometimes that even understand the scope of accounts that have MFA and don't. Maybe an organization is going through an enrollment process. They've been going through it for some time. There might be some legacy accounts out there that we didn't map out initially as part of our identity asset mapping exercise that are still out there that single-factor authentication until someone actually registers a device. So it's important to follow this process and understand the scope of accounts that you have out there that still are in that enrollment process, kind of stuck there, because we see attackers will compromise those accounts. They have the right password, and then they'll just register their own device to that account and kind of blend into the noise, and they can gain access to the organization. And it's also having a process, right, to understand how long as an organization do we want the accounts to remain single factor while waiting for a device to be registered. How can we validate with users that they actually enrolled the device that's associated with their account? A great hunting tip here would be if you're looking for your MFA device associations, and maybe you have SMS as your MFA method, or a method that actually captures the device's phone number as part of it. What if you see a phone number that's registered to multiple accounts? That might be very odd. That could be something that you want to take a look at. Or if you have multiple device IDs, which are actually bound to multiple accounts, that could be something to take a look at. But really having that validation process, informing the user, allowing the user to provide feedback, of something that maybe is associated with their account that they didn't actually initiate. And once again, just really give you more context. It goes back to the 3 C's, right? Context, correlation. Very, very important piece to our MFA onboarding and lifecycle process. Very quickly, we're going to talk about devices. Challenges that we see: lack of governance for devices and what these devices have access to. Inconsistent tooling for visibility and verification. Once again, we want device to be part of that authentication and authorization process. If we don't have the right endpoint telemetry, if we don't have the right PEP, right, one of the stems of the brain is not feeding for all of our devices, we're going to be blind and we might miss something as part of our architecture. What are the minimum security requirements? This is not something new, right? This is something organizations still struggle with, is endpoint hardening, having a standard process to ensure hardening happens, and misconfigurations, which could allow for rogue device registrations. So Active Directory, believe you can, by default, a user could register up to 10 devices. All they need is just a valid Active Directory account. They don't need a privileged role to do that out of the box. Recommend that you tweak that. Same goes for Azure AD. Out of the box, organizations could join devices to the Azure AD. And once again, just making sure that we have actually processes in place to really control that registration process and validation component of this. I think the important one here when we're talking about zero trust is that second bullet, because we work with a lot of organizations that have integrated zero trust technology stacks and private access and all these other fun things. But sometimes it doesn't seem like there's continuous validation, or there's validation across all the pillars of identity, devices, network, applications and workloads and data, is really understand for the technologies that you're looking to pilot and perhaps onboard, that they can really absorb the telemetry from your endpoint in the event that there is a notification of a potential compromise, a backdoor, Mimikatz being ran. Have that be part of the telemetry that's fed to the PDP to help make an informed decision. And hardening requirements for endpoints, right? We want to enforce that if an endpoint gets compromised, that it's not game over for the organization. If certain credentials are compromised, and if that is patient 0 that's used for lateral movement and pivoting, right? We want to ensure that we're hardening our devices to at least buy ourselves more time to respond and hopefully contain. And processes to revoke sessions. We love to if we have a compromise or potential compromise, let's reset passwords, let's do all these things. Sometimes we forget about active sessions that are, maybe they have a lifetime of 12 hours, 24 hours, maybe they don't have a predefined, duration. How do we go and actually revoke sessions? Is that part of our process? Is that part of our playbooks from a device perspective? This is a very important concept. I think I once spent like 20 minutes on the slide, so I only have 10 minutes left, so we're going to go fast. This kind of, in my opinion, can go against some of the principles of zero trust, but there comes a time you might have to hit the reset button, right? Something bad may happen. You have to have processes pre-planned, pre-gamed out. Where can you start to reconstitute your environment? Not just from like, let's restore from backup type thing, but how do we re-onboard our identities and validate that I'm giving the password to the right user? That if I'm going to require a user to re-register their MFA or validate, where do we want that to occur from? Is it going to be from the internet, or do we want to have pre-established zones of network infrastructure that we trust, that we manage, that we want all of this to funnel through? So it really is important to plan out if something bad happens and you have to hit that reset button. What can you actually do within your environment to ensure and to gain the confidence that what is happening is based upon segments and infrastructure that you consider to be trusted? Kind of goes against zero trust in some aspects, but if you don't have this, I can tell you we're working with organizations to try to revalidate identity devices, and even multi-factor authentication devices that are correlated can be very, very difficult if it's just open from the Wild West, because there could be attackers that still have valid credentials that could just kind of blend into this whole re-enrollment and revalidation process. So you definitely want to get some guardrails around that. So very quickly to kind of wrap things up, what are some other risks that we see from a zero trust architecture perspective? We talked about the PDP, right? The PDP is the centralized brain. It's going to require admins to do administrative functions, right, to make sure it works properly. It's synergizing all of our different technology stacks, and our processes are working, and our trust algorithm is working. So we really need to protect the identities and the accounts that have access there, right? These should be separate accounts using like just-in-time type administration. We don't want these accounts that have, keys to the kingdom for our PDP to be the same accounts that we use for daily functions and daily tasks, right? So it's very, very important that we put guardrails around this. We also want to ensure we have proper visibility to what's happening within the PDP. It could be a misconfiguration that happens, but a potential misconfiguration in your PDP, if this is now your lifeline, it's the brain of your architecture, could lock out users, it could invalidate access to legitimate data, or it could be used by an attacker to actually pull back some of the hardening and some of the guardrails that have been configured within the environment. The identity provider, if the PDP is the heart, if the PDP is the brain, the IDP is our heart, right? This is going to be what the PDP trusts from a source of truth for identity, right? So here are some common challenges that we see facing the IDP stack within organizations, and here are some things we can do to harden these. Some of these concepts we've already kind of discussed. This really goes back to that privilege slide of pulling back the scope of privileged accounts and putting guardrails around how those accounts can be used. Kind of talk through this with the adversary in the middle phishing exercise. But once again, stolen valid sessions that are post-MFA authenticated is a real thing. There's Redline Stealer, which is out there, which will actually steal, post-auth cookies from browsers that can be used to potentially replayed in for access to resources and data that are behind MFA. So reducing session lifetimes. If token binding is supported when you use FIDO2 UTF, that can certainly go a long way towards mitigating risks here. But once again, this is certainly a threat vector to zero trust architectures. Last but not least, we've talked through these, but once again, the process side is very, very important. I think there's probably the most bullets here because it's super important. Just all of the elements that we spoke about of having defined processes and structure around your foundation. You start building things on top of a foundation with cracks, it's going to fall down eventually, right? So we want to fill in the cracks as much as possible. These are the common process gaps and weaknesses that I think are often overlooked when we're thinking about zero trust, and even non-zero trust, just our common architectures today. All right, so apologize for the eye chart here, but I do want to show that with organizations moving to the cloud, right, there is practicality of using the cloud service provider from the big three tools and mechanisms that exist today that align within the pillars of Zero Trust. So if you're on AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, right, there are ways that we can actually achieve the principles and adhere to the pillars of Zero Trust just using some of the native offerings within the cloud service providers. Now, not to say all these are free out of the box. There does come a cost with some of these, but it is certainly possible if you're moving from on-prem to cloud to start aligning some of these controls into that synergized PDP, if you will, to really create a good foundational element for your cloud journey. So very quickly, just want to highlight the governance, the visibility, monitoring, the orchestration is, those are the core foundational blocks for an effective Zero Trust architecture following the principles of verification for authentication and authorization. And it kind of goes back to, some of the basics. So we really want to have, understand what is driving us towards a quote-unquote Zero Trust architecture. Is it certain requirements? Is it certain types of data? Are we looking to protect, crown jewel applications that, if so, where are they? Are they on-prem? Are they in the cloud? Defining our requirements so we can start building things around those requirements. Identify our attack surface. We showed examples of that with the identity mapping graph of just how sensitive and the level of exposure we might have. But it's also important to do that not only for credentials, but understand from our architecture perspective, our data, our applications, what is the actual attack surface of these things and what can we do to harden that? And then the inventory mapping is a huge part of this, right? We did the identity mapping exercise. There's similar exercises we can do for our data, but really want to align strong principles around what we have and what we're looking to protect. Identify any gaps. And Zero Trust, right? This is not going to, like some of these elements that we spoke about, they're not going to happen overnight. This is going to take, this is typically a multi-year type strategy and roadmap. And we recommend, start slowly, phase it in, test onboard applications. Maybe they're not the most sensitive applications. Maybe they're not the ones that are part of our initial requirements, but they provide a good, safe test bed to test out, our processes and what works, what doesn't work, and what can we do. And it's also good to use these as a test implementation when you're red teaming or purple teaming. So if identity or session-based risk is identified, did our PDP act accordingly? Did it actually, with the automation that we have, did it terminate that session? Did it require re-authentication? Is everything working as planned? And that's part of the test, monitor, and refinement piece of all this. So that being stated, I think we have 2 minutes or so. So if there's any questions, happy to answer any. Yes, sir.
Great recommendations. Great recommendations on some of the pillars that you described. The question I had for you is around really the data pillar. Since there wasn't a lot of emphasis, at least
Yes.
on this slide, what are some of your recommendations around data protection for customers? And the reason I ask that is a lot of attackers, whether they're nation state or financially motivated attackers, at the end of the day, they're really focusing on stealing data, right? So what are some of your recommendations as it aligns with the Zero Trust principles?
Yeah, so I think DLP can certainly be a great form of a PEP, if you will. But I really think from the attribute-based perspective, especially if we can line tagging and attribute-based controls, we can build that into our trust algorithm with our session-based risk to, once a user is authenticated based upon the data that they want to access, we can actually map that from the tagging perspective. And you can actually enforce, you can actually pull back to say, if I detect risk in this identity from this device, but this is the data that this identity or device is provisioned to, based upon this tag, I'm going to cut off that access. That's a harder part because, yes, data classification is a big piece. I didn't touch on it here just from a time perspective, but that kind of aligns to that inventory and that mapping. Yep. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone hanging out for the last session today, and I hope everyone has a great day and a great weekend. Thank you.